We just heard from Vera Jako with some classic Magyar Nota. We heard a vocal version of the tune that is normally known as the Brahms Hungarian Dance Number 5. In Hungarian, the words say Csendül a nota, which means the song rings out. Next up, we're going to hear from our special guest, Theodor Kundtz. So, from our special guest, John Kundtz, who will be channeling Theodor Kundtz, I guess. So, John, you are the great-grandson of Theodor Kundtz, yes?
Yes, that is correct.
That's correct. Now, where was your great-grandfather born, and when did he come to Cleveland?
Great question. So, first of all, let me just thank you guys, Elizabeth and Walt, for having me on the show. I am sort of humbled and astonished that 150 years later, after my great-grandfather emigrated to the United States, that the people in Cleveland, particularly the Hungarian community, stop me, and when they listen to my last name, they almost all know of my great-grandfather. So it's pretty amazing, and like I said, it's very humbling, and I'm very honored and gratified to be able to talk about him.
I'm so glad you could come and make time for us, share your story.
So the history sort of Theodor and his journey to the United States is a bit interesting. In fact, we've discussed it on one of my podcasts. We called it Ethnic Confusion because technically Theodor was born in a town called Metzenseifen, and it's just over the Carpathian Mountains. It was settled in the 1300s. It's a typical small sort of town. It focused actually more on ironworks than woodworking, although we believe that Theodor's father may have been a cabinet maker himself and actually gave Theodor apprenticeship, which sort of got him into the woodworking and cabinet business. But the net of it is today, Metzenseifen, and it was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, but most people in Metzenseifen spoke German, although they identified as being Hungarian, and therefore the ethnic confusion. And to make it even more confusing, today the town is called Medzev, and it's actually part of the Slovak Republic, and it's about 25 kilometers from Košice.
Košice, currently, it was known during the period of the Kingdom of Hungary, known as Kossuth. Yeah. And there are a lot of people in our area who came from that area, including a lot of musicians, but we'll get to that later.
Excellent. So that's sort of the backstory. In 1873, Theodor, his father died, and like many people, decided to emigrate or to travel to the United States for, better work, better life. 1873 was when he started his journey. He went from Metzenseifen over through Germany, over to France, to Port of Havre, and boarded a ship called the SS Denmark. Now, this was not what you would call a luxury cruise liner, and certainly Theodor probably had no money. So my guess is he was in the bottom basement quarters that were slow. The ship was slow. It was uncomfortable. It was unsanitary, et cetera. So I just can only imagine that trip probably took a couple of weeks to get from France to New York City. Once he got to New York City, there was no Ellis Island, so you could quickly emigrate, got through, and took apparently a train, came here to Cleveland. Best of my knowledge, the reason he came to Cleveland was there were some fellow Metzenseifens, I guess you'd say, the Gideons. And there's a large Gideon families here. And so I think he had a cousin or a second cousin or some sort of relative. And like many times that you go where you know somebody. So he came here, and we'll get into it, but his first residence was on 41 Franklin Avenue, which we'll talk about when we get into the Irish and the importance of that when we talk about Irish Town Bend. But what was probably more important is that he got a job as an apprentice at a cabinet-making company down in the Flats. It roughly was right near where the powerhouse is today on the west side of the Flats. And you can actually, right where Spaghetti Warehouse used to be, and in fact, rumor has it that tavern across the street was actually his office. And you can still see today some of the remnants where it says woodworking. But long story short, he got a job. The company that he worked for was called the Cleveland Cabinet Works, or Sewing Machine Cabinet Works. It had financial trouble. Like a good entrepreneur, decided to take his pay in equity, and a few years later he bought the company out and renamed it the Theodor Kundtz Company. And at that time, their primary product was sewing machines. And we can talk more about that and the importance of that to the White Sewing Machine Company.
Yes. Now, so at this point, he's living in Irishtown Bend and has established that factory. At this point, were there many Hungarian immigrants living in Irishtown Bend yet? Because we're talking still the 1870s. Is that correct?
Correct. So about 1873, Theodor lived there, and I'll go back a little bit. So the factory was at 122 and 124 Elm Street in the Flats. So it was certainly walking distance to the Irishtown Bend neighborhood. 41 Franklin is an interesting address because if you Google it, you'll never find it. And the reason for that is, of course, in the city's infinite wisdom, they decided to renumber the streets 3 different times. So in the 1870s, it would have been 41 Franklin, and it sort of morphed to 81 Franklin in the 1880s, and then ultimately today it'd be 214 Franklin Avenue. And it's essentially right where Columbus Avenue hits the top side of Irishtown Bend, and the house was sort of between, it was literally with walking distance down the hill from St. Emerick's today, where St. Emerick's is today. And there was a road, there was a little strip of houses between Riverbend Road and Franklin Road. And we're pretty sure, based on some work that Margaret Lynch and her brother have done and some other family history, is that's where he lived. Now, to answer Walt's question, at that point, I don't know, but what was very interesting, and why I think there's some real interesting, connections here between Irishtown Bend and the Theodor Kundtz Company. First of all, Theodor couldn't find qualified workers, so he did like what a lot of people did. He went back to his hometown and to his home country, and he started helping people come to the United States, and he would hire them in his factory, and so. That's one reason why we have so many Hungarians in Cleveland, because he was facilitating that.
Yes, because certainly the biggest immigration from Hungary to Cleveland really got going into the 1880s. Because when you spoke of the ship that your great-grandfather came on, in the 1870s, things were still very, very rough. By the mid-1880s was when steamship transport became more advanced. The trip became somewhat shorter, although it still was long, and it certainly wasn't comfortable. I know my grandparents talked about this, and they came a little while after that, though still around the turn of the century. But so, and again, we see this situation where there's sort of a chain that is set up where people let people know back in the old country, hey, there are jobs here, and we could use you, and then they tell their friends and neighbors. And so this begins this chain of migration, which we see, and I mean, we still see the same thing over the decades and even unto today, though a bit less so with the Hungarians now. But please go on with the history of
course.
Your
so that timing is exactly correct, because he established the company in 1878. So shortly thereafter, in the 1880s, would have been when he was looking for workers, particularly skilled craftsmen, cabinet makers. Back to Irishtown Bend neighborhood. When Margaret Lynch and some others were starting to do census records, they found out there were certainly Irish people there, but they had started to move out by that time, and it was a neighborhood of skilled and semi-skilled workers, as I'm told. And so it was a natural place for immigrants, particularly Hungarian immigrants, to settle. And so when Margaret was doing her research and looking at the census records, she called me up and she said, hey, I'm looking at the census records, and all these people are listing their birth of origin as Hungary, and when we look at their occupation, they're cabinet makers, woodworkers, iron machinists, laborers, and even musicians, which is a whole other story, maybe a time for another podcast or another show. But so that's sort of what we believe is why they started to come here. And of course, they could all walk down to the 122 and 124 Elm Street where the factory was. And so there was why he sort of established it. And so the primary business in that 1880s was sewing machines. So he sort of essentially became the sole supplier for the White Sewing Machine Company.
And also, just to add a little bit more context, we have to remember that in the early 1880s and mid-1880s, even the electric tramways, the streetcars, had not yet been established. So most people lived in places where they could walk to work. We see that also with the settlement patterns in Tremont, where people could simply, whether they were just an ordinary worker or even a manager, could just walk down the hill and they would find themselves in the flats. We had a similar situation with Theodor Kuntz's factories with Irishtown Bend.
Right, so it was convenient and very practical, right? I mean, the timing was just about right when the Irish workers moved out, the Hungarians moved in, and then the company really starts to bloom.
Correct. And speaking of timing being right, that's sometimes it's better to be in the right place at the right time. Mm-hmm. And certainly at the turn of the century, sewing machines were considered actually a beautiful piece of furniture, and they were expensive. And so people would buy them with elaborate cabinet works, and they would prominently place them in their house. Not like, when I was growing up and the sewing machine stuck in the closet, right?
My grandmother had one.
Yeah.
And they were beautiful with ornate ironwork.
Correct. And so that was sort of the core business, allowed them to grow, but it didn't really stop there. What's really neat about what I think and what really made Theodor important to Cleveland and certainly the Hungarian population that supported that was he expanded, not actually by accident or somebody asked him, into school furniture. Mm-hmm. So if you ever sat in one of those old school desks and it says Eclipse on it, they called that was probably made there.
And he also expanded into other kinds of furniture.
Correct. So he had a number of patents, 41 or something like that, actually why he was elected to the Cleveland Manufacturers Hall of Fame. But one of them was bicycle rims. So he learned how to bend wood, apparently, and he made wooden bicycle rims. Wow. And they were very expensive. They were very high-end. These weren't like what you'd buy for your Schwinn bike, but these were like classic Tour de France kind of rims, very popular in Europe. He got into automobile bodies, made automobile bodies for Winton and White and Peerless, all Cleveland automobile manufacturing companies. Got into the school furniture business, sort of parlayed him into the church furniture business, which he actually bought from one of his fellow practitioners at the church he was attending, who was aging out and wanted it. But I think one of the most cool things that he's done, and we will talk more about this, is he did, as part of the school furniture, he supplied all of the 62,781 seats that were in the old Cleveland Municipal Stadium.
Now, that municipal stadium was built as part of the Great Lakes exhibition in the 1930s.
That's correct.
And many, many of our listeners remember it. It unfortunately was torn down and replaced by the current stadium, which is also on the lakeshore. But that was really quite an impressive stadium for its day. It was owned by the city of Cleveland, and it was actually surrounded by walkways and gardens, which many people don't remember when we talk about repurposing the lakeshore. Now, have any of those seats survived?
That's a great question, and it's because just to back up, it's sort of it's not easy, but there's a large supply, if you will, on the third market, the antique markets of sewing machines and school furniture. But to my knowledge, this stadium, when they tore the stadium down, they had no plans for that furniture, those seats. And I think I heard they just, and I wasn't smart enough to go get any, but I think they just sort of gave them away. So they're around, but they're not, there's certainly not 62,000 of them around, best of my know. They're hard to find.
So it seems like a great memorial, both to the people who worked in that factory and to your great-grandfather, would be if some of those seats could be put into the Irishtown Bend Park. Now, is there a way, if somebody has one of those seats, that they could donate it?
Right. So actually, there is much more to the story. I mean, it seems like Theodor was an incredible entrepreneur, and he was very open to possibilities, like he would purchase the furniture, the church furniture business. So any opportunities, he just jumped right on it. And this is such a beautiful story of from rags to riches, American immigrant story, isn't it? I mean, to consider how he came to America at the bottom of a third-rate ship, in the sense it was not Queen Elizabeth's ship of any sort by far. It's the complete opposite.
Well, it is the classic, I had no money. I left my family at home. I had no idea where I'm going. And I found a place to work, and I did my best. And to answer your question about his community, let me talk a little bit about his community involvement, because I think there's a little bit of a legacy here that will then go back to answer Walt's question, which is, he played a pivotal role here in the Hungarian immigrant community. He founded the Hungarian Savings and Loan Company. Mm-hmm. He financially backed the Hungarian Hall that was on may still be there, on Clark Avenue in 1890s. He sent money. He was instrumental in funding and facilitating the monument in Hungary, in Budapest, of George Washington. What else did he do? And then he was just he was very, so I'm told, very sort of low key, didn't like the attention, but was very philanthropic. And so, back to Walt's question, Elizabeth and I have been talking about this, and I thought it would be a great opportunity if we could find some of these Cleveland Municipal Stadium seats. Since they've lived outdoors for all these years, they would be perfect addition to the park. And we could put, so if we could get our hands on them, and somebody would be willing to donate them or buy them, sell them at a reasonable price, I think that would be a great tribute, not only to the park, Irishtown Bend, but also to Theodor's legacy here in Cleveland.
It would be a natural thing.
Who could they contact if somebody has some of these seats and would be interested in doing this? How could they get in contact?
Sure. Well, I'm sort of become the self-appointed family historian archivist, so there's certainly, I'd be happy to field those calls.
Exactly. Wow, wouldn't it be fantastic if one of our listeners actually had some of these benches in their attic or their basement or the garage, and we could actually have the original handiwork of Theodor Kundtz in the park to commemorate this incredibly important Hungarian.
But he had quite an effect, and it's one of these strange things. We're at this point where there are very few people still alive who remember that area as a Hungarian neighborhood, because that was basically torn down by the early 1950s.
Right.
And very much like other neighborhoods, for example, Buckeye Road had originally been a German neighborhood, and then all those Hungarians moved in,
right,
and Slovaks too, of course. And similarly, Irishtown Bend was founded by the Irish, but as the Hungarians moved in, the Irish moved out.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
the Irish moved out first.
Vice versa, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
Well, as the Hungarians moved in, the Irish moved out.
So there was a nice little shift. And of course, we'll be talking more about Theodor Kundtz and his legacy and how we could remember him and all of the other people, the tremendous amount of people that he sponsored to come to America and work here. And some of them started their own company. If I remember correctly, he was urging some of his workers to start their own little entrepreneurial business. Am I correct? I mean, I saw that somewhere.
I believe so, yeah.
That he said, well, you know, you don't have to work for me forever. You could start your own. I mean, that's what he did, right? He was a great example.
Well, that's great to hear, because it's a big difference between the experience of working with him and the experience that many of the so-called old settlers, the öreg-amerikai magyarok, the Hungarian immigrants that came at the turn of the century, that worked either in coal mines or in steel mills here, where they were faced at that time with their wages constantly being cut and really being exploited with the idea that they were disposable. And it's great to know that there was somebody who was not behaving like that towards our early immigrants.
That's my understanding from just family lore, that he said he was the friend of the worker, and we'd walk the plant, and he would make sure that things were well. I mean, he was in a serious lumber accident, which because he was touring the lumber yard and wood fell on him, and that's why he walked with a cane for all those years. But it wasn't all roses. There's some history where there were some strikes and things like that.
I'm sure it wasn't, but still, it's a big difference between the usual stories we hear of the coal patches and that sort of thing in the company store.
I will say, when I meet many people that are from Metzenseifen, and they credit my great-grandfather for bringing him to the United States, most of them articulate a pleasant experience, not a, oh my God, I can't believe your grandfather.
Yeah, he was a slave driver,
right.
sort of a thing. He was inspiring.
That's what I've heard. So
other immigrants.
I hope that's the case.
Yes, that's my understanding. And reading the book and hearing some of the stories.
And maybe you can briefly tell us the title of the book so that people can find it.
Appreciate that. So my dad's brother commissioned a book on Theodor Kundtz, originally published in, when was that?
1994?
94. Went through 4 editions. It's called Tory in America. It's written by Christopher J. Iben, and he's actually is a very good author. And another plug. So the book is hard to find. I believe the Cleveland Public Library has it. Lakewood Historical Society has one. There's a few floating around, but it was a private publication. And actually, one of the family initiatives right now is we're taking this book and we're turning it into an audio book. So sometime early first quarter next year, Tory in America, the story of Theodor Kundtz, should be available via audiobook.
And Tory is spelled T-O-R-I.
Correct.
So that's Tory in America. And is that America with a K?
Well, the way the book is spelled, it's A-M-E-R-I-K-A.
So in Hungarian.
Yeah. It's spelled in Hungarian or German, depending how you look at it.
That's true.
So, and Tory apparently was the name or the nickname that Theodor, I don't know if he gave it to him, but that was his nickname. He would introduce himself, I'm Tory.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, listen, it's been wonderful talking to you. We're going to hear a little bit of music, and then we'll be back to things.
Thank you.
Good. We will continue.
Now, we're back in the studio with John Kundtz.
Yes. So, John, if we could ask our audience once again share with the audience of what the plans are to commemorate the incredible legacy of Theodor Kundtz at this park. The idea, the plan is to find stadium seats that Theodor Kundtz actually made, and we could contact you, John, and if you could tell us the contact there, if anybody knows of anyone.
Sure. First of all, I just want to thank Elizabeth and Walt for having me on the show. And again, as I said, I'm humbled and honored to after 150 years of people still wanting to know a little bit about my great-grandfather. But to answer your question, yes. So the plan right now is we think if we could get our hands on some of the original Cleveland Stadium seats, they're easy to spot. They're this really ugly yellow mustard color, but nonetheless, I think they'd be a great addition to the Irish Town Bend Park. And if you know of any, or if you know of anybody that has them, please feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much for coming in
John,
and joining us.
Thank you so much for making time for us and sharing all this information. And we plan to have you back here as an update to this magnificent park planning for the Irish Town Bend. And in addition, I would like to put out a picture of that bench that we're looking for on the Hungarian Hour Facebook page so that people have an idea of what we are looking for. But were there other colors than just the mustard yellow?
Not that I'm aware of. That's all I've seen. I mean, he made stadium chairs for other stadiums like Boston's Fenway Park, a couple others, but all the ones I've ever seen are that. But if anybody, we could quickly tell if they are or not just by somebody sending us a photo of them.
Super. So do look at our Facebook page. Tory in America book is going to be posted there as well, and also a picture of the type of seat, the stadium seat, that would be ideal to, if somebody has them. And, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if some of our listeners actually are holding on to one of these, or 2 or 3. 4 would be ideal. That's what we were talking about, 4 different seats next to each other. But 2 or 3 would also be very beautiful and acceptable and ideal. So do contact us. And thank you again for making time for us to come down and share all this important information.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.